All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first panel this morning. Let's talk about race in the workplace. My name is Anne-Marie Richard. I am the Patient Engagement Lead in the Internal Medicine Unit at Pfizer. I also chair our Global Blacks Community Greater Boston branch at Pfizer. This is one of our colleague resource groups. And finally, I'm also representing Pfizer as a founding member of the Color of Biotech Massachusetts.
Okay, so we'll start off with an introduction to our esteemed panel here. I will say that in the interest of time, I won't go into full bios for each of our speakers. I invite you to join the MassBio website to take a look at the full profiles for our speakers. So today we have four panelists. Our first panelist is Charlotte Jones Burton, Dr. Charlotte Jones Burton, who is the president and founder of Women of Color in Pharma and Vice President of Global Clinical Development at Otsuka. Our second panelist, Jose Escobil, who is the co-founder of Latinos in Bio. Melinda Ng, People Partner at Bluebird Bio. And Michael Ruiz, who is Project Manager of Global Protection Corporation. So we'll start off with the questions. We're going to jump right into it in the interest of time. So the first question I'll pose to Dr. Charlotte Jones Burton. Charlotte, in your experience working in the industry, what are some of the signs that racism is an issue in your workplace?
Thanks for that question and welcome everyone to today's session. First, let's just start off by defining what racism is, just to make sure we are all on the same page. This is as defined, I would define it as people in positions of power who have practices that maintain their power or control, and it usually is the dominant culture. There are a spectrum of practices that I've seen, from hiring to management of people to the execution of the work that is done in the industry, where signs of racism can be seen. And maybe we can just go through each of these fairly quickly. Overall, I would say that these practices really happen when we're not intentional and strategic about being sure that we have diversity in everything that we do. So as it relates to hiring, for example, I've seen, and I'm sure many in the audience have seen as well, where job postings get shared before they are actually posted, and there's already a list of preferred candidates in mind before the posting happens. As it relates to management of people, this racism shows up by not providing opportunities for individuals to grow who are a part of diverse groups. And these may be not providing direct feedback over time, not including them in projects, and not giving them visibility. And as it relates to the execution of our work, the way that racism can show up is through not having collaborators that are diverse, including scientists, clinicians, and then also not having consultants, those in which we hire to advise us on our strategy and the work that we do, not having diversity as it shows up with there. So there are many different ways where racism can show up, and many of these ways, I'll just end by saying, are covert and they're not obvious, but when you see these practices, when you see the outcome of these practices, which is usually that we end up not having diverse talent in positions of impact and positions of leadership within our organizations.
Thank you, Charlotte. This is so true, and I think this is all through the industry. I have certainly seen the same thing. I'm actually going to pose the same question to Michael. So Michael Ruiz, can you share a little bit from your experiences and with your background, your unique background of being Mexican and Navajo? Talk about what you've seen in your industry, but also your experiences.
Yeah. Thank you so much. First, I want to start off by thanking every one of our esteemed panelists for being here today, and for Anne-Marie for hosting us, and MassBio for having me. But I want to pick up on something that I think Charlotte touched on that I think is super important, which is the pipeline for talent coming into the industry, which is what my experience has been most reflective of. Seeing people coming into industry based on generational wealth, social and political capital. And we have to admit that in Boston, there is this culture of elitism in the tech industry that starts really down at the bottom when it comes to who gets into what university and studies STEM, and then moves on into the industry later on based on connections or those types of generational wealth that I think are really important if you want a seat at the table, especially at the top when you want to become an executive. So I think that that's what I've seen the most, which is, you know, these firms that don't want to hire like outside of Harvard or MIT or whatever elite institutions there may be. And I think that those biases are inherent throughout the hiring practices. So that's what I've seen the most, and that's been most reflective of my experience. Full disclosure, I did attend Harvard for 2 years and then left that institution for personal reasons. But it's super easy to see that. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Michael. Now, and you hit a key point there on sort of the pipeline too, right? The pipeline and the hiring, because we talk about, you know, having few Blacks and people of color in the sciences. I think there is tons of talent out there, and it's a matter of meeting them where they are. But I think we also need to build that pipeline, right, from early on in terms of who gets the opportunities to go to in those particular careers in the life sciences and in STEM. And so I think it's both, right? And it really hits upon us to really tackle it from the very beginning in terms of getting students into STEM to fill that pipeline. So we'll move on to the next question. So now that, you know, we talk about recognizing the fact that there is racism in our companies, that it does exist within our walls. I'll pose the next question to Melinda to sort of help us understand how within your company, how are you minimizing the role that racism plays in sort of the persistent struggles and inequities in the workplace for those who are underrepresented and some of the other ethnic groups that exist?
Awesome. Thanks for the question. I just wanted to chime in with everyone else. Thank you for having me. And like, I am so glad to be a part of this amazing panel, and thanks MassBio. You know, diving right in, I think the easiest way is to like, not just talk about it and assume that it's not happening within your organization and start doing something about it, right? Awareness is key. And the best way to do that is really leveraging the diversity data because there's no subjectivity to that, right? And you can't really like push back on what the data is telling you. And the data that you use, you should be tracking it throughout the entire employee life cycle to see where within the organization are these pain points, right? Just to like what Charlotte and Michael were talking about, is it in the very beginning about the pipeline? And when we're thinking about recruitment, when we're thinking about elitism in the biotech industry, the people that are making these decisions are people probably from similar groups like white males, right? And so when they're talking about culture fit or team fit, whether it's conscious or unconscious bias, they're creating sameness, and there's like some concerns about disruption, and that actually impacts people of color, right? So really challenging that thinking. Then it's also looking at the data when you're thinking about performance management, talent development, promotions. What is the story telling us? Are Black employees getting promoted at a significantly lower rate than other employees? That's a problem, right? Are our Latinx employees in certain roles longer than other people? And again, you know, you have to dig in and understand what is the meaning and the reasoning behind all of these things. And when you're thinking about like mentorship, executive sponsors, who's involved and who's not involved? And there's pulse surveys, attrition data, everything that you can see, like, are people leaving at a significantly bigger rate, like Asian employees, because they're not getting career advancement opportunities? And so once you start using the data to tell these stories, you're going to be able to see where the systemic racism is within your own organization and make a concerted effort to do focused training opportunities and like really trying to break down that stuff.
Thank you, Melinda. And I'll pose the same question to Jose. So Jose, I know you also come from a very small company, but based on your location, in the Bay Area. I believe the demographics of your company is already pretty diverse, right? You have a diverse workforce. So where is the focus for your company in terms of equity?
Thanks for having us all. And I think I want to pick on the same themes that Melinda, Charlotte, and Michael brought up about the pipeline issue. Our company, Cypherome, is fundamentally about using genotypes to be able to tailor medicine for individuals. And the primary motivator is because most medicines that are on the market today, about 1 in 5, are pharmacotoxic to communities of color. It's not the reason why we do it. It's also toxic to people of European ancestry, but it disproportionately affects us, and it'd be a digression to share here why. But so there are sort of 3 things that we try to do in the company, and I think also my colleagues and I have rallied around this and creating an organization called the Latinos in Bio to be able to create both leadership and mentorship opportunities for younger professionals of color. And I had to write them down because everybody's so smart on this panel. I wanted to sound smart too. So the first is on this pipeline issue, do something. There are employee resource groups that you could get involved in, or other similar organizations that could provide an opportunity to network and find out who you are in your organization. We founded Latinos in Biothinking. There would be about 20 Latino professionals in biotech. We're over 230 now, and we're not even a year out of the gate. And I really want to acknowledge MassBio's help and ED String Fellows in particular in helping to advise us as we go along. The second is mentoring practices. I served on an external advisory board to Vertex, and it was sort of shocking to me the best practices that we use right in the same, no more than a few blocks away at one of those schools that Michael talked about, MIT, is that when we create mentoring situations, we don't do them 1-to-1. We do them multiple to one so that the mentee has the ability of diversity of opinion to understand and be able to place in context what their mentor is saying, whether their mentor is a white person or a person of color. That makes a huge difference in terms of helping younger people understand how to be able to manage their careers and what opportunities are good, as well as giving them more exposure to the company. And then third, it's this notion of advocacy that I think those of us who are a little older in positions of responsibility, I think have as a duty. And by advocacy, I mean vouching, promoting, and creating opportunities for people to meet other people that they wouldn't ordinarily, so that they can build social capital. So those are the 3 things that I found it, for me, effective and that we've gotten behind at Cypherome and then also in Latinos in Bio.
Thank you, Jose. Excellent point. Creating those opportunities. I wonder, so considering we have, multiple different ethnic groups we're talking about, right? In terms of creating these opportunities, and maybe I'll pose that to Jose, can you share with us how can we best understand race, the differences in race and class? And we know, we have all these multiple impacts, right? Sort of the intersectionality of these different issues. How do we understand those? And are organizations really grasping the degree to which members of these different communities are affected?
Yeah. I've recently been listening to Kamala Harris's book that she wrote before her election, and she spoke that her mother taught her to think and then do. And I must say that that's a good recipe. As a scientist, I was trained to observe before doing, but I think as a Latino man, I was taught to have empathy and to think about my community. When I was younger, when I think of that question, when I was younger, I was a member, very active in college and after in coalition groups, where it was a little bit of a Noah's Ark of different representation of people. And the fight then was not for what slice of the pie we would have, but to grow the pie so that we could all benefit. And one of my earliest things I remember was getting behind a case at Brown University where it was clear that Asian Americans were being admitted at a lower rate to achieve a constant matriculation rate independent of the application rate. something that I think survives now 30 years later into the public. But I think over time, I think America has changed institutionally. I think there are lots of milestones we can see, but it's not over. I mean, I think in the specific case of how I view this, I view us in a community to make up, et pluribus unum. I mean, I think that came up yesterday in a very important person's speech at a convention. And it just strikes me that it's in our shared interests to have us all be able to work together on these common themes about equity, about access, about justice. And as I shared as a scientist, I'm trained, and in our field, everybody's talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, but in fact, there's a racial epidemic, a racist epidemic, if you want to call, that's happening at the same time that is finally hit a tipping point. And I see the two as intricately tied to one another, and they can't be unwoven. When in this book that I'm listening to now, Kamala Harris's first person narrative as a prosecutor, how these cases were about her community, and the empathy that she brought to it was an insight about challenges that were affect everybody, but that she refracted through our experiences. I think our leadership could do well to listen to our communities right now, because I was sharing before this call, 100% of my network of Latinos and African Americans have at least one family member who've had COVID-19. And it's stunning to me because it's not true for my white friends. And it's a stunning statistic, that, and maybe it's because I'm from Miami and Florida's crazy, but it's just stunning. I'll leave you with that thought about listening.
Thanks, Jose. Interesting. So in the interest of time, I just wanted to reach out. Edie, do we have any questions coming in? Unfortunately, we had all the technical difficulties, so I think we are running out of time. I wanted to make sure we get at least a couple questions from the audience. Edie? All right, so we'll take one more question from there, if not. So I'll take it to Charlotte. So Charlotte, you're the founder of and president of the Women of Color in Pharma. And I know you and your team have been working to develop some guidances for companies on how to take action to advance equity within their companies. Can you share just real quickly some best practices that you would recommend to companies in this current climate and in building equity?
Yes, thank you. And so, as you've mentioned, Women of Color in Pharma, which is an organization which I founded and currently the president, has really made it our mission to work within the pharmaceutical and biotech industry to advance equity in all aspects of our business, from discovery to commercialization, so that we are able to make medicines for all people. And our best practices that we have shared with companies at a recent think tank that we had really include knowing your data and being able to sit in the truth of that data, and being able to acknowledge to those within your companies and across the industry where we are and where we want to go. And having, number two, a commitment from the leaders within your organization. It's important that we start with the CEO, but we know that it's not just the CEO who is running and making decisions within companies. So it's important to ensure that you have leaders who can be empathetic, who are culturally competent, and who can really stand behind the vision for change that we are calling for in order to advance equity. The last thing that we really think is a best practice is not just focusing on talent. Many times these conversations around diversity and inclusion focus on talent. Talent is important, but we miss the opportunity to really see where we can advance equity in our business practices. Most of what we do in this industry is related with clinical trials. So who are the leaders who are developing the clinical trials? What do the protocols look like? Who are the scientists therapists that we have coming in to advise us. Everything that we do must be, we must have inclusive practices and diverse individuals helping us to really drive forward and advance equity. And the final call to action that Women of Color in Pharma has for the industry is that we collaborate across the industry and not work within the silos of each company in order to make this meaningful change that we need to see, and what we believe is a small period of time that we can see it, and that will come by us collaborating together and really sharing these best practices. This is not an area for us to be competitive.
Absolutely. Excellent points to close on. And you made a very important point here in terms of the clinical trials, and recognizing that when we talk about diversity in our trials, it's not just about the patients that we're recruiting, right? It really has to do with the entire group of who's running the study, who are the investigators recruiting the patients, and the whole group needs to be diverse, not just the patients, right? So I'm not sure, we're out of time, but I am not sure if we're given more time because we have technical difficulties, but there's a second panel. So I am going to close it out just to make sure that people get to the second panel. So I'd like to thank everyone for their attention. Thank you, our panelists, for an excellent discussion. And we will be transitioning to a second panel, which will be cross-cultural solidarity in the biotech industry. That's moderated by Amory Johnson.
Hello, and welcome to our second panel of the MassBio 3rd Annual ED+I Conference. I'm Amory Johnson, and I'm actually trying to do too much right now, so I'm going to make sure I don't end up with too many technical difficulties because I was trying to watch the other sessions, but I'll log back on. Apologies. Again, I'm Amory Johnson. I'm the CEO of Inclusion Wins. I'm based in Basel, Switzerland, and I am delighted to host this second panel that's entitled Cross-Cultural Solidarity in the Biotech Industry. And what I want to just frame a little bit before we go into it, because we're not going to spend a lot of time talking through our speakers, because when they start to speak, you won't really need an introduction. You'll go back and read their bios, but they're pretty awesome. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading through those things that you can go back on the website and take a look at. But think about the notion of culture as something a lot bigger than what we often see. So there's so many different levels of culture in organizations. And there are some individual cultures, some cultures around identity. And then of course, there's the grand organizational culture and all the various values that come out of that. So we're going to be talking about a little bit of all of that, believe it or not, in less than 30 minutes. And we hope that we get plenty of questions from the audience. And if we don't get a chance to answer them all, hopefully we can give our responses back to Edie if MassBio is so inclined to share that data. So I'm going to jump right in. We unfortunately are missing one panelist today, so it's going to be in addition to myself, Dr. Aman Kara and Chris Haig. And we're going to jump right into it. I'm going to start with you, Chris. You've been doing this work in the space of equity, diversity, and inclusion for quite some time. And in the current times that we're in, particularly within this industry, where must we focus to move towards those old-fashioned elements that we often hear about as it relates to workplace culture? We often hear about them, but we don't so frequently see them manifested. And we're in a pretty amazing moment in the world right now on so many levels. Where do we need to go? How do we need to do it? And what do we need to focus on? Chris.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the question. Thanks for allowing me to be here. Happy to be here with you all. Big question. How do we do it? Well, if we knew we'd be there, right? If this work were easy, we'd be there. And I think that is often the struggle, is that sort of it gets hard and it gets confusing and we don't have the roadmap, if you will, right? And so the whole idea of culture and, you know, the culture of an organization, it depends who you ask, right? And so I think, you know, we've heard culture fit and all this kind of stuff, but there, like you said, there's many cultures within an organization. So it depends on your perspective, your position, your cultural lens. And I guess, you know, where I see companies across all sectors struggling is, I want to say the equity piece, right? And so I guess I want to back up and sort of just name, like, so we have diversity, inclusion, equity, and we're often using these words wrong and interchangeably. And we have to take a step back and really understand what they mean and then commit to them what they mean, right? And so diversity is simply the presence of difference. And it is all of us and it is all of our identities. It's those we see or think we see, those that we don't see, or the ones that we're not aware of. I mean, you know, the human species is very diverse, right? So we want diverse workforces. But then that next level of inclusion is, okay, whose perspectives are more valued than others? Whose experiences are considered the quote unquote norm? And so often when I hear that phrase, you know, that sort of, you know, workplace fit or culture fit, we're defaulting to a norm, which often, especially in US culture, is white and whiteness and often male, right? And so we privilege some experiences more than others. And then lately, especially now with this conversation of being, you know, we want to work towards racial equity. And so equity is getting more and more play. And, you know, I have a colleague that says, don't use equity unless you mean it. Because what we're talking about with equity is power, right? And so inclusion, you know, valuing all voices and experiences, and we know innovation comes out of that, et cetera, et cetera. But equity is looking at the systems and structures of your very organization, right? And so if you're talking about being an organization that is about racial equity, we need to look at, you know, we talked in that last panel about hiring processes and things like that. Those systems in themselves are inequitable. And so we need to move towards creating new systems that are more equitable. That's the hard part, because it means thinking completely different than we have. It's recognizing that our current policies and structures benefit some and not others. And I'll say for myself, as a white individual.
I'm going to interject in there. You talked about systems and structures. You know, well, I mean, that's for people in an organization, that's a lot, right? Like, what do you do about that? What is it, a design thing? Like, what is it? Because it's, you know, those things are so ingrained and they're working. So, I mean, how do we pivot from the workingness, for at least working for somebody, right?
Working for who? That's the
exactly,
question, right? Working for who? You know, and I think about, you know, I mean, let's just be honest here, especially in US culture, because the important thing is you have to apply. When we talk about equity, we're talking about history, systems, policy, sociology, ideology, politics, all that stuff creates systems of inequity. And so you have to examine that within your own country, within your own place of being. But so in the US, let's just be honest, our systems designed for, made by white people. If you think about the history, so we're going to systemic racism here, right? If you really want to follow that conversation around Black Lives Matter and systemic racism, we're talking 400 years of systems and policies that have benefited some and not others, you know, and specifically benefited white folks. So when we think about, you know, our hiring practices and we just can't get a diverse applicant pool, it's because the system has always benefited a certain identity, and mostly white identities. And so to answer your question, how do we get there, right? I don't know. If I did, I'd be a bazillionaire, but also we would be there, right? We would be there. And this is where organizations fail, because we get to that point where, oh, this is hard, this is unknown. But if you're talking about equity, like I had a client that I was talking with the other day who had a large pool of temporary workers. And it happened to be that over 50% of those workers are people of color, which did not match the full-time position, which were more predominantly white. And so we can have a long conversation about how systemic racism played into that. But there was a call from staff that said, can we make those temporary workers permanent throughout the rest of the year because of the economy. And so the leadership was like, well, our budget cycle this, our board this, or da 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 da. And so I had to stop them and say, okay, well, I've heard you say you want to be anti-racist. Is that correct? Yes, 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 we do. Okay, so everything you just gave me is created in system of whiteness, the board, the financial procedure, da, 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 da. And if you truly want to be anti-racist, you need to think differently and create different structures that are more equitable.
Wow,
And that's the scary part.
That's so powerful, Chris, because what you basically said is, don't choose white supremacy, choose humanity.
Yes.
And that's a beautiful segue to Aman. Aman, you've been at Worldwide Clinical Trials, and when you entered into the organization, you were focused on building a culture with an emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness. Why was this so important to you, and what does that culture development look like at Worldwide in the wake of everything that's happening in the world? And I don't need to repeat what's happening in the world. So Aman.
Thank you so much, Amory and Chris, for your very valuable insights as well. So I've come into this, diversity, equity, and belonging, inclusion. However, the big landscape of this very vast arena, actually, because it was very personal to me. Okay, so over the years, I realized, working in the CRO industry, I've built teams, I've built functions and regulatory affairs and what have you. And in the CRO world, for example, we're not concentrating on a particular product for development, okay? Like teams are usually in the biopharma industry. We're kind of jumping in, for a set project, and then we jump back out again. So I guess you could say people that are in the CRO industry are looking at the breadth and depth of, whatever falls on their desk as such. And, as I was building teams, I realized in order to, have real cohesiveness, it was my responsibility as a functional manager, right? And wherever I was, recruiting globally or locally as well in a set location or office location, that I really needed to think about how I would make it welcoming, because I truly believe that, and here's the thing about dimensions of diversity as well, not everyone should think the same anyway. You need that innovation. You need people to push each other. That does not happen by A, people looking the same, right? And B, people thinking the same as well. So my experience, kind of my journey into this space, started off as a personal journey. And I actually went back to school to learn not only what academics in this space had researched, but with my cohort that came from a spectrum of industries globally, I have to say as well, we learned about the commonalities in this space as well. And I did not want to be just a token brown person, if that makes sense. I did not want to be that.
It definitely makes sense, Aman, yes.
Yeah, I did not want to be just that. I wanted to make it, when I was speaking about, being diverse and inclusive, I didn't want to be like, well, okay, you're just speaking as, a person of color. Actually, I kind of know a little bit more about this space as well, because I know what other industries are doing. And so it's kind of been a side gig for me as well. Mm-hmm. And I don't claim to be kind of an expert, but I have weaved it into the work that I do. And when I was hired in at Worldwide, having spent 17 years at another CRO, I did not hide the fact that, this was a journey I was going on to. And, credit to the team I work with, they loved that. And, I found that kind of like openness and saying, look, I have some ideas. And, they were equally as responsive. And that goes back to ED's beginning, and in this whole conference as well earlier on today, that, it's leadership that really need to step up and say, we are committed. But then to Chris's point, you know, it's great to have words, we need actions as well, right? So, and, you know, studying about this, I kind of had an aha moment. And I'm thinking this was the missing piece about people. And I thought more about bringing back humanity back into the workplace. To Chris's point, we talked about this, right? And, you know, I am loath, you know, I looked at different dimensions of diversity. And look, we know in this whole space, right? You know, you can have a diverse company, but it might not be equitable or inclusive, and belonging is where it brings it together. So, you know, I love the fact that, you know, my voice is heard, and culture development, you know, the best laid out plans and thoughts from senior management, wonderful, okay? But it doesn't come just about because it's frameworked by just leadership. That's just one piece of the puzzle for me. It also comes from the grassroots, you know, of the organization, the people, the workers.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely.
And I think my take home from this was that, you know, with my journey about how I needed, you know, through my career, I can tell you, I've, you know, like everyone, I think in this conference, we can all speak to barriers, right? So not only did I have a barrier as a woman, but I had it as a person of South Asian descent. Oh, but add in, I'm a person of visible Sikh faith as well, right? So how do you put me in a box, and how do you solve my issues, right? You know, you can't put me in a box, you know, and that's the same for everyone. So I thought about kind of, for, you know, in order for there to be a thriving culture, do we not come down to just, you know, the basics of having a safe space for everyone as well, to be themselves, to be their authentic selves, in addition to, you know, what is determined at leadership level. Right?
That notion of kind of a, for lack of a better term, a sociological safety, I think it's become more central because we hit the pandemic and dynamics around racial justice. I'd say we're having our Emmett Till moment of the 21st century. And now, what do we do to pivot? And I want to welcome Nariman both to the stage. And Nariman, we've been talking. You joined us, and you've been in HR for quite some time, and you have worked for a big firm, and now in the U.S., and now you're working for a Japanese-based firm with Eisai. What makes the Eisai culture different than what you experienced working in a US-based company? And how would you describe the difference that's made, if any, during this time of a pandemic?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. It's great to be here, and thank you to all of our panelists. Great to be a part of this with all of you. As you said, I have been very privileged to have worked in this industry for over 30 years, and I've worked for some fabulous companies during that period of time. My current company is Eisai, and I joined Eisai in 2004, so I've been there for quite some time as well. When I first joined the company, I quickly realized that there was something very different about Eisai from what I had experienced in the past. It took me a little while to fully appreciate, to fully understand just how deeply embedded the culture of that organization really was. And it's a culture that's built around a concept called human healthcare, or HHC, as we lovingly refer to it. HHC was introduced back in 1989. So it is, it's something that's been a long time in the making. You know, for over 30 years, the company has really relentlessly pursued patient interaction for its employees, and learning from patients and deriving learning from those patient interactions. Simply put, HHC says we give our first thought to patients and their families. And we know that's a pretty simple statement, and we know that's a statement that every healthcare company can rally around. But Eisai absolutely brings it to life. We hear that from anyone who joins the organization. People feel that difference because it's woven into everything that we do, right? Every discussion that we have, every decision that we make, every employee meeting that we hold, HHC is a part of it. Patients become a part of it, and they become a part of our lives. So we require that every employee spends at least 2 to 3 days of their working time each year at a minimum. And lots of people spend more, but they have to engage in activities that are directly with patients. And we provide all kinds of opportunities for them to do that. But it does create an incredible connection for people. And that, you know, we will often receive feedback that says these were life-changing experiences. And so it's that deep connection that really brings people together. It connects them to the company and our purpose, right? And it's a real unifying force.
Sure.
You know, as I look at it and think, how has it remained so relevant for such a long period of time? It's really something that is constantly renewed. It is refreshed, reinvigorated over time, and it's constantly reinforced by management. You know, when I first joined the company and I attended my first sales meeting, and I'd been to big sales meetings before, the CEO from Japan had come in for that meeting, and he was up on stage addressing the sales force. You know, and he made it clear that he wasn't here to talk about sales or profits, not even about the brands. He was here to talk to them about HHC and how do you use HHC to guide your decision making?
Wow.
How do you keep the patient at the front? He says, I'm not going to talk to you about sales or profits because we know that sales and profits will come if we do things the right way. And so it's that continuous delivery from the very top of the organization that says, this is really important. It is who we are. It is our culture. We want you to engage with patients. We want you to understand their realities, their hopes, their fears, their dreams.
It doesn't sound, you know, I've been a little bit taken aback at times around the platitudes that companies put forth. And what it sounds like from you all, there need to be platitudes because your whole reason for being is very clear to everybody throughout the company. And there's a clarity that you're interdependent with the patient. They're not a transactional thing that you just do so that you can make sure that you get your bonuses every year. And I think that kind of mindset leads well and probably allowed you all to move through this pandemic with a lens that said, yeah, we need to be focused on making sure all of us are safe, just like we do our patients, because if we don't do that well, we won't be able to serve them well either.
Absolutely. It has absolutely helped us through the pandemic.
Fantastic.
Right? Because we've had such close sort of collaboration between people. There is that closeness, that unifying force, and it has helped to keep people together and remain focused on, let's be sure we're still serving our patients in the best possible.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Nariman. So we have one question, and Edie has joined us as well. So if there's other questions, Edie, we'll go ahead and open it up. I had one more question for the panel, but I don't want to lead back. I don't want to leave the audience in the dark. So let's go ahead and take those questions. There's one question that I have right now. Edie, were there others?
I don't see any questions at this time, but I am still looking through the chat messages, and I'll get back to you in just a sec to let you know if there's more questions.
I have one from our host in the background, Ethan. And this is for all of you. I'll actually start with you, Aman. What specific changes can be made in hiring and recruiting practices to impact diversity?
From a personal perspective, when I have recruited people, right? When I'm building a team, I've disrupted myself, right? In that it hasn't been so much a case of, you're right, like there was conversations earlier on in panel discussions about, you know, when sometimes job adverts are kind of, thrown out into the public domain, when really you already have a short list available, right? So, you know, throwing that out. So it's wonderful. I kind of opened up a requisition, and I've seen in my experience, you know, you kind of see what's going on and you talk about the culture as well. So what do? You know, you need to look at the lens and say, if there was a person from, say, a minority community or a community, a person that you haven't quite, you know, you don't really see as a leader, you know, you don't see them in your leadership team or something, you need to change that, because, you know, there are cultural nuances as well. You know, for example, it took me a very long time for me personally to kind of step up to the plate and not be so much, in my culture, it's more about always being helpful and just helping. And, you know, and I thought I have to correct that a little bit, and that I also have to learn how to lead. Right. So really, you know, I'm going to throw that out, you know, and I know, you know, our panelists, you know, I'm with esteemed colleagues here, but, you know, for me, it's been about disrupting myself as a functional manager, right? About what I thought I knew, throw it out a little bit, you know, think about it a little bit further.
Thank you, Aman. Chris, any thoughts?
I love what you said, Aman, because I often talk about, because it does feel really big. Like, how do we change all of this? And so we always have to start with within our own spheres of influence, right? And so I love that you said disrupt myself, and we should all, you know, take on that mindset, because as we were saying a little before too, it is a way of being. It is not a checklist. And the more we are in that way of being, the easier it becomes. And the other thing that I would say, and I always go big picture, is that understand that your recruiting and hiring practices are not happening alone in a little bubble, and understand that they are tied to everything with the organization, right? And so it's not just about getting a diverse workforce in the door, it's also paying attention to your environment. Is it inclusive? What am I, like when I come for an interview, what am I seeing? What are the questions you're asking me? I can tell right away if your values are just values on a wall or if you're living them. Right, so you need to embed it in the culture, right? And to sort of the equity piece too. I want to look at your policies. I want to look at your procedures, right? And so understand that it is all connected. And yes, there are a lot of great best practices out there for recruitment, which an easy Google search will help you find that. But understand you can't do this stuff all in little pockets. You have to have a strategic vision for where you want to be, and all of these pieces are connected to making that happen.
Yeah, I think sometimes people think that skill set or mindset follows skill set, but I think skill set follows mindset. So if your mindset is in a particular space, you can take these practices and actually deepen them, because they're not, you know, so-called best practices aren't the best practices for every single organization. And so it's important to find, you know, what works for you, but most importantly, where is your head around this whole idea of equity and inclusion? Because it's hard if you've always done things a certain way and you've been successful. Yeah. So it seems like it's intuitive for some people. So thanks for sharing that, Chris. Any thoughts from you, Nariman? And then we're going to move to our closing question.
Yeah, so recruitment for us is a big activity as well. And you know, as we've gone through the past several months, I've done a lot of outreach to employees themselves in the organization, to some of our African-American employees, to some of our Hispanic employees, right, to get perspectives, and also to talk to them about how we can do greater outreach, right? What organizations, what are they familiar with? What do they belong to? Who do they hear from as they're tapped in? And we know that our employees are tapped by others. And so we've gotten some great insights through that process, and we're now exploring various avenues to do some virtual work. There are networks out there that are allowing companies to come in and virtually present to their audiences, present the company and present your, you know, employer proposition. And so we're taking some different avenues as we look to increase representation across the company.
Great, thank you so much, Nariman. I'm going to move to our final question. There's a few questions from the audience. I'll let you all think about them. When you consider equity and advancement, what is the key lever in the organization that will have the greatest effect? Huge question. followed by another huge question. Any exercises the panel would recommend on how to identify racist, inequitable practices and structures? So those are two different questions that I don't think we have enough time to go down the path of in a minute. But I would like you all, just in kind of 30 seconds, to what one thing would you say, practical thing, should organizations consider as we move through this time that we can really transform organizations to build equitable mindsets so that we can sustain this work? What's that one thing? And I'll give you 30 seconds and I'll start with Chris.
Oh man, just one thing. I mean, I think it does go back to a mindset, right? And so if you're truly committed to equity, and I'm using that word, non-inclusion, or if you're committed to equity, understand it is a marathon and not a sprint. There's no quick, easy fixes. There's no checklist. And so we have to embody this as a way of being. In the US, inequities are 400 years in the making. In other countries, there's thousands of years in the making. And so understand that we have to do as much as we can on that self-work, that self-education, which goes to that second question too. If we're the center of our sphere of influence, we have to self-educate, and so that we can start seeing it better. I can't make you see a racist system or structure, but we can do that self-education to get us there. Commit to the long-term journey, and know where you want to be. Right? That's your goal. Hold on to that. That should inspire you.
Thank you, Chris. I'll go to Nariman next, and then Aman, you can close us out.
I would say that it's important within organizations for all of us that we take this from being an initiative to this is the way we do things here, right? As I've given you the example of culture and how you can really develop and sustain a culture, it's by continuous reinforcement by all layers of management. And until we can get to that point on issues of diversity and inclusion, it simply becomes an initiative and it becomes a check the box with, I've done these tactics, so we're good. And we've got to get off that and truly embed it into the culture of a business.
I'm allowed to say amen, amen. And I'll go to Aman to close us out.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, so many thoughts, right? And I know we've only got 30 seconds, but I always think of learning, continuing to learn. Okay, we can talk about this whole, we can read websites, we can see the statements out from organizations, companies, and what have you. And I really look carefully, by the way, when I'm looking at an organization. The first thing I do is I look at their website and I see their team structure, their leadership. And if I'm doing that, I can tell you other people are doing that as well, right? To see, okay, what kind of faces do I see? Do I see people like me, perhaps? Do I see other voices concerned? So that happens, by the way, by each and every one of us continuing to learn. And, I hate to say it, but we need to advocate for change. We need to constantly advocate for change because I don't want this conversation going away. Just because right now we're having this conversation, and I want to hear us moving forward that, say this time next year, if ED is kind enough to invite, a few more panelists again, that, we've moved forward, in that year, but it's not just the same thing we're talking about. It's not the tick box and, so I'm a bit more, I guess I'm a bit cynical when I do look. And I'm like, yeah, I want to see action. And data does not lie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Aman, Nariman, Chris, MassBio ED+I Conference, annual conference. Thank you for the time. It has been an absolute pleasure. I am wanting to have so much more of this conversation, but unfortunately, Edie is nicely looking at me and saying, it's time for us to transition. So stay with us as we transition to the last panel, which will be on moving on to the next normal and how will it impact equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's going to be moderated by Adrian Hawkins, and they will cue you to move into those to that new room in just a second. Again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to see everybody again in the not too distant future. Bye now.
Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Hawkins. I'm an immunology account manager with Novartis. With Novartis, I am a tenured diversity and inclusion champion. I co-chair Capable, which is our disability inclusion ERG. So we bring awareness from a disability and inclusion standpoint to Novartis colleagues. As well, I chair a newly relaunched a Disability in New Jersey affiliate. As I stated, my tenure and long-time advocacy with DNI has enabled me to bring individuals, allow them to bring their best selves to work. I'm going to be leading this discussion, closing discussion, moving on to the next normal and how it will impact equity, diversity, and inclusion. With this, the changing practices, cultural dynamics, and technological innovation pushed forward by the pandemic of COVID-19, the response have forced us to rewrite the playbook on our workplaces. It gives leaders such as us a unique chance to propel their ED&I efforts. The silver lining of the post-pandemic, gives us the advantage to be bold, break majority culture, and topple businesses as usual with its behaviors. We have proved that we can do better and that we can create lasting change. So at this time, I'm going to introduce our panelists, Andrew Dobos, VP Organization and Talent Development, Moderna, Sarah Echohawk, President, American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and last but not least, Jill Houghton, President and CEO of Disability Act. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and start the discussion, and we're going to start with Sarah with the first question. Sarah, where it comes to injecting equity in marginalized and neglected communities, can you discuss this as we talk about the next normal and how it will impact ED&I?
Sure. Thank you, Adrian. And again, hello, everybody. Sarah Echohawk Nawa. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and the CEO of American Indian Science and Engineering Society, or ACES. So happy to be here, and we're talking about marginalized or neglected community. Of course, for me, that means Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, but also First Nations in Canada, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, Alaska Natives. So those are really the populations that I'm familiar with and that we work. And in terms of injecting equity in through the lens of what we're dealing with now through COVID, I think one of the things, even prior to the pandemic happening, that is important and that we often try to point out is that often our population, because we tend to be, we're small, about a little over 2% of the total population of the United States, we're often left out of DEI discussions and efforts. And so our issue really has been invisibility and really just having a voice and being recognized, as I'm sure my colleague here, Jill, also experiences with her population as well. So I think what this pandemic has brought in some of this is some visibility to Indian country and to Native America, as we've seen that our population, among other people of color, have really been hit hard with the pandemic. And I think a lot of people have seen what's on the news around the Navajo Nation, which was the largest tribe in terms of land mass being impacted by COVID. So in terms of injecting equity in these communities under this new norm, or at least what we're experiencing for now, I think there's some opportunity, and then there's also some issues. The opportunity there is because our population, or many of the population that live in rural areas or on reservation communities, often are left out of the workforce because of the remoteness of where they're located. So certainly with things having to be forced to be virtual and companies looking at more opportunities to do remote work, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. The flip side of that is the digital divide, and in Indian country and in these reservation and rural communities is that there's still a lack of internet access. And so that is one of the big issues that we need to be addressing as a nation if we want to literally include everybody equally. And so when we look at that, we want to figure out how to provide better internet access in these communities. These communities, the reservation communities, are really struggling right now when they don't have that kind of access, when online school is happening and students literally are like having to drive into the parking lot of their schools and try to work off laptops, if they have laptops, just to get internet access. So we know that a lot of our students in Native America, their only access is through cell phones. And even then, that's difficult in some of these remote areas. So I would say that, for companies looking to work with this population, one is that the remote work offers tremendous possibility if that's, if that can be integrated, but also recognizing that there may be some challenges that need to be overcome in terms of access. Again, internet access. So I'll leave it at that, and I don't want to marginalize, or monopolize the conversation.
That was great. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next question, Jill. As we discuss progress in the workplace from an accessibility standpoint, can you shed light on that, your thoughts?
Absolutely, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity, Adrian. So as we talk about people with disabilities, let's just acknowledge, first of all, the level set that we're talking about 1 in 4 Americans who have a disability. We're talking about 1 billion people around the world. And 70% of us have disabilities that you can't see, right? So this is an interesting year, not just because of the pandemic, but it's the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So 30 years ago, people with disabilities in the US, it was a historic landmark piece of legislation, right? It was civil rights. It is civil rights, economic opportunity for all people with disabilities. And it gave us things like access to public transportation. Or curb cuts, access into buildings. So if you think about things like curb cuts, not only do they assist people who use a wheelchair or a walker, they assist parents who have strollers. They assist us when we're traveling and we're pulling our suitcases. They gave us captions, which helped the deaf and hard of hearing population, but they also help us as customers if we're in a sports bar and the TV's on and there's lots of action, we can read the captions. So what we like to say is that the thing that the ADA hasn't given us yet, 30 years ago, the front door, getting in the building was access. If we fast forward to today, the new front door is technology. It's our phone. It's the payroll system. It's everything that we do on our computers. It's all of the applications and the technology that we use, and actually that we use more than ever right now as we work remotely. And so the opportunity becomes not just access around the built environment, which is still a very important issue, but what are we doing around the accessibility and the digital inclusion of our technology? Now, what I'd tell you is that I think that COVID has created this opportunity for us to really lean in with employees with disabilities and to identify what are the barriers and what do we need to do to remediate these things. I also think that what this remote access has done, a silver lining, is that it's given the opportunity to tap into some under-tapped talent pools that perhaps your company hasn't taken advantage of. So for example, my good friend who happens to be blind, who lives in an area where transportation is a challenge because it's not ultra accessible, employment has been a challenge for him. But COVID created an opportunity for him to be part of that talent pool because he can work from home. Now, what the key to the equation is that the technology needs to be accessible. Last, I would just say that, you know, it does create an opportunity for us to lean in and look at the tools that we're using and just identify how they can be made better.
Thank you very much, Jill. And I'll just tag on from a digital accessibility standpoint at Novartis. I mean, you know, when the pandemic hit, we had to, from a closed captioning standpoint, you know, elevate the utilization there, in which it was perfect timing, in, you know, which we, you know, just closed in on, you know, a contract with a company. So we were in place there to utilize closed captioning, but also from a field standpoint, from an associate standpoint, now everyone is utilizing computers, you know, from home. So the hearing impaired, visually impaired, we had to, you know, do things there. So digital accessibility is definitely key during these changing times. So thank you very much, Jill, for sharing. So Andrew, to move on to you, caregiver concerns from a homeschooling, parents, grandparents in the home, etc. Can you share thoughts around caregiver concerns?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, Adrian, and thanks everyone for spending some time on these topics today. You know, we've had an interesting journey at Moderna here the past 6 months. I think probably several of you now know our company's name who may not have ever heard of us prior to about 6 months ago. And, you know, so we've had sort of a dual push. We've had a push to respond to COVID-19 and the pandemic internally to make sure that our workforce is whole and able to stay productive, but also, you know, cared for, and, you know, to care for the world, we hope, you know, to work very hard to push a solution perhaps out to all of you. And so please, you know, keep your fingers crossed for our workforce and for Moderna. But, you know, Adrian, to your point about childcare, this was something that popped up immediately. You know, we've had some of our workforce that's been fortunate enough, you know, present company included, to be able to work from home. And to sort of shift the paradigm and to manage family commitments, to manage whether it's childcare, whether it's parent care, elder care. It may be just simple, you know, supporting another member of your family who can't work from home, right? You know, with their caregiving responsibilities. So for that workforce, you know, we've provided tools and technology, you know, and started to shift the support to allow for flexible working environment, flexible working hours. Maybe it's easier to work on the weekend a bit. Maybe it's easier to work in the evening a bit. And then of course we have a workforce that has to do their work in a facility. And so we've also kind of surrounded those folks with different tools and programs. We put in place a pretty progressive backup care program to provide either in-home or or adjacent to our facilities care. We were able to partner with a couple of really great organizations. We have a good internal food service provider who actually helped us put meal kits together for folks to take home, where maybe they've had a long shift, they've worked some extra hours to try to push things forward even faster and even harder, and so taking that meal kit home at the end of the day might be just a little bit of saving grace they need to take a breath and and spend some time with their families. And so we've tried to again understand, listen to our employees and support them in the best way that we possibly can as an organization, so that both we can care for and support this workforce, but also again to serve our mission for patients.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for sharing. Jill, I'm going to come back to you. Safeguards and shielding teammates and employees that are at high risk, that are vulnerable. What are your thoughts there? Example, asthmatics, people over 60, those with diverse abilities. Thoughts?
So, first and foremost, I think that your greatest resource are your people. And in the disability space, we have a saying that is nothing about us without us. And so I would encourage you, if you have a disability employee resource group, to work through these issues with your ERG, BRGs. What we're hearing, some examples in terms of safety, things like looking at how to apply technology applications in new ways, right? So perhaps it's scheduling staggered employee arrival times and office days, or kind of managing the entry flows and elevator traffic, enabling food service, ordering and pickup, automating accommodation processes. I think it's really important in these times to make it, and really in any time, let's just say, to make it easy for employees to request accommodations, to get the support that they need and to find the resources. So streamlining your accommodation processes, aggregating that information into central portals, and improving the searchability and visibility of how to request accommodation. I think we're seeing companies reconsider facilities and space. So evaluating, how much space is needed, determining how spaces are reconfigured, exploring increased use of and touchless entry to things like elevators, installing plexiglass barriers. And I would call out that, at Disability Inn, we are the place where companies come to learn from each other about disability inclusion. So if you go to our website at disabilityinn.org and you click on resources, we have a bunch of COVID-related resources there, and you can actually, there's different topics: mental health, accessibility, things that you can click on and just learn what different companies are doing in this space to safeguard their employees and people who may be more vulnerable or more compromised.
Thank you very much, Jill. Thank you. The final question, and actually I'm going to pose this towards Sarah and Andrew. We'll start with Andrew. From a recruitment standpoint, recruitment, retention, development, inclusive culture, accountability, sustainability, doing things differently. Share your thoughts from this aspect, Andrew, and then we'll go to Sarah.
Happy to. Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something Jill said there. You know, it's interesting because I feel like we've been, you know, to some degree pressed into service by the times, but I think we've learned a lot as an organization. I think, you know, we're learning a lot as a community about some things that we could do differently, you know, that can endure well past, you know, past the pandemic phase that we find ourselves in now. And so things like Moderna has a strong onboarding program that had been exclusively in person, and we've learned to adapt to that. And what it does, I think, you know, is first of all, it makes it more intimate, right? It makes it a different kind of connection, a little bit more personal, which I think is a strong upside to all the time we all spend in Zooms these days. But you know, we've learned that as far as development goes, and pivoting course offerings, and how we help people access more and maybe access things on their own time or set schedules versus sticking in a box of time. Earlier on, Sarah, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on this as well. You know, Jill, I think you touched on remote work and talent pools, not, you know, perhaps non-traditional as far as our organization goes, access to talent pools other than we might have been accessing. And I think that's a strong upside that we're learning about as a relatively young and emerging organization. We're learning about, you know, where we might be able to go and access different kinds of talent, you know, if we're not necessarily only building teams here in Cambridge. And so I think it's taught us a lot. And I think, you know, yes, we still have some pandemic period ahead of us, but we're all certainly looking forward to when we can call it post-pandemic, and what learnings we can take from this and build our culture in a more inclusive way, you know, going forward.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Sarah, do you have anything to add to this, you know, especially from a recruitment standpoint? I know we were talking, you know, about your organization, but would you like to share any insights surrounding this?
Well, I you know, think some of what I touched on earlier, and certainly what Andrew was talking about. I think, you know, thinking about how to do some of this remotely and differently. And while I think it's important through this pandemic, again, I think there are some real possibility here, as we've all been discussing, about this being something that we can continue to do and integrate. And I think we were talking about hybrid conferences, but also, you know, more or less hybrid models in terms of recruitment and reaching out to different populations. I think if anything, with you know, recent events that have happened in the last few months, you know, it's key to be working with diverse communities and recognizing that that they should be part of the workforce and should be on the radar for everyone. And that I think, now I can't remember who said it, but that it's important to be working, I think it was Jill, important to be working alongside your ERGs, other folks within your company, and using them as a resource to develop those practices, because certainly they know their communities best, and they can, you know, assist in developing those plans and strategies for recruiting diverse talent. I think the other thing is to consider as we move forward and move through this, is that we really need to see more people, diverse populations in leadership positions. Because if we see those folks in leadership positions, then as I've seen like Intel and other companies do, then it really does make a difference in terms of increasing diversity in the company as a whole. So I think that that will continue to be key, regardless of, you know, where we're at in terms of the pandemic, is just recognizing that it has to be more than just talent acquisition, also has to be integration into, you know, leadership positions and having a bigger voice in what's happening. And that will certainly make companies more successful in their diversity recruitment strategies.
Yes, yes, indeed. Thank you very much for sharing, Sarah. Ethan, are there any questions? I'm trying to see if there are any questions within the chat. Okay, so in closing, from, you know, Sarah, Jill, Andrew, any final, you know, comments? I know from my standpoint, this whole change thing, the whole, pandemic, the next normal, for me, it's just elevated the creativity, the innovation, and it's just really it made everything just, it put it on fast forward, just to make things happen quickly. And I see, for the most part, I mean, we've been successful. I mean, there have been learnings and we're continuously, learning, but I think, we've been successful. It's a lot more to do. It's a lot more learning. So Sarah, Jill, Andrew, closing comments.
Yeah, I'd be
We'll start
happy to, I think Adrian, it's a really good point. And I think what I would highlight for, the Moderna team, and probably what I'm hearing from the rest of the panel as well, is we've learned as we've gone through the pandemic so far that, the pandemic is not affecting all of us equally, right? It's affecting people in very different ways, and that sort of amplifies the need, to be inclusive, right? To create an environment where, however, you may be impacted by the pandemic, or, post-pandemic, by your own personal, circumstance, how we at organizational levels, right, have responsibilities to, from a talent acquisition perspective, Sarah, as you touched on, through to developing, the next generation of leaders and beyond, we have a real responsibility to be inclusive, to build a welcoming environment. And, this has sort of brought a microscope perhaps to those efforts, like I said, in a way that's more accelerated than we could have imagined. But the point, is nevertheless incredibly important.
So this is Jill, and just kind of building on everybody's comments and Andrew's comments. I think that one of the things that this has done is created an opportunity for us to really talk about mental health. And it's like the unspoken part of disability. According to Accenture research, 9 in 10 of us are touched by mental health. And this has created an opportunity that we can take beyond COVID, post-pandemic, and to really lead with humanity, to show empathy and to be available for each other, to stay connected, to check in, to see if our employees have what they need, to use this as an opportunity to lean in and look at our benefits. Are there additional benefits that we should be providing in this space to provide the support that employees need? And lastly, again, just all roads leading back to the people. Engage with your ERGs. And if you don't have a disability ERG, perhaps this is the opportunity to begin one.
Yes. Thank you very much, Jill. Sarah?
I just, again, want to echo what the other panelists have said and agree on all points. There's some real opportunity here to reach some populations that perhaps hadn't been, reached out to enough before, and realize the value that they can bring. And I think to Jill's point, intersectionality in terms of, what our different groups do and where they intersect and how we can support one another. So, I think we were talking about if there's a silver lining, right? So I definitely think that, that would be the silver lining is, some of these things we pointed out in terms of, more intimacy and, some of these opportunities. And then again, to interact more closely with your ERGs and get in touch with those communities where maybe you haven't traditionally worked, and recognize that there's some real value there, and hopefully that will carry forward even after or post-pandemic when we get there.
Yeah. I want to, thank you guys very much, Andrew, Sarah, Jill, and in closing, before I turn it over to Edie, I just want to say, as we deal with people, the mental health, the mental wellness is definitely key as we go through a change. So those resources, I mean, those resources are key for mental health, mental wellness. So if the organizations don't have those resources, that's something definitely to invest in. So again, Sarah, Andrew, Jill, thank you guys very much for a wonderful discussion. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Edie. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.